Most people see a 78-year-old man in a faded cardigan sitting alone on a pharmacy bench, and they see someone invisible. They see a problem. They see someone to avoid. But on a Wednesday afternoon in late September, when the sun was cutting gold through the glass doors of Riverside Pharmacy in Millbrook, Kentucky, Margaret Chen saw something very different. She saw her father's best friend of 43 years asking for help with a trembling voice. What happened next would shake the entire town awake. Frank Moretti had been coming to Riverside Pharmacy every Wednesday for 6 years. It was the only place left that knew his name. The pharmacist, Danny, always waved from behind the counter. The techs called him Mr. Frank. It was a small ritual. The same bench, the same time, the same quiet dignity. Frank had spent 52 years working construction in Millbrook. He'd built half the strip malls, the water treatment plant, the new elementary school library. His hands had literally shaped the town's physical existence. Now, at 78, he lived in a small apartment above the laundromat on 5th Street. He had no family in town. His wife Sarah had died 11 years ago. His daughter lived in Seattle and called on holidays. But every Wednesday, without fail, Frank came to pick up his medications. 3 prescriptions. Blood pressure. Heart, diabetes, the pharmacist usually had them ready by the time he arrived. Frank was wearing the same navy cardigan he'd worn since August. It had a coffee stain on the left pocket that he'd never quite managed to clean. His shoes were Velcro instead of laces. He had arthritis now, and ties took too long. He moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned not to waste energy on anything but what was essential. His face was weathered in the way that comes from decades of outdoor work, but his eyes were still sharp, still blue, still looking directly at people when they spoke to him, a courtesy most people forgot to extend in return. On this particular Wednesday, something was wrong. Frank sat on the bench for 30 minutes after Danny had called his name twice. He wasn't moving. He wasn't reaching for the pharmacy bag. He was just sitting there, staring at his hands. Danny came around the counter. "Mr. Frank, you okay?" Frank didn't look up. "I can't pay for them this week." That's when the 3 boys walked in. Teenagers, maybe 17, maybe 20, that age where they were still forming, still deciding what kind of men they wanted to be. They were the kind of teenagers who made noise wherever they went. Not loud noise, just the noise of people who had never been told no. They moved through the pharmacy the way people who've never experienced consequences move through the world, like the space belonged to them. They didn't see Frank at first. They drifted toward the back, grabbing energy drinks and protein bars. The expensive ones, the kind that required parental money or no parental supervision at all. But then one of them, the tall one with the expensive sneakers, noticed Frank on the bench. He noticed the cardigan. He noticed the Velcro shoes. He noticed the pharmacy bag sitting unclaimed next to a man who was clearly waiting for something that wasn't coming. "Yo," he said to his friends, and that single syllable contained everything. Everything, the tone that meant, this is going to be funny. Frank didn't move. He knew that tone. He'd heard variations of it for 78 years, but he still hadn't developed immunity to it. He looked up, made eye contact. That was his mistake. "Looks like old man's got money problems," the tall one said. His friend laughed. They all laughed. It was the laughter of people who had never been humiliated in their lives, practicing on someone who had been humiliated so many times he'd stopped counting. They approached the bench like it was a stage, like Frank was an audience they decided to perform for. Frank reached into his pocket slowly. He had $47.13. That's what he'd counted that morning. The prescriptions were $80, $2. After the pharmacy bills, after the rent on the apartment above the laundromat, he was $90 short every month. He'd been managing this the same way for 2 years. He would pick up the most critical one, wait 2 weeks, come back, pick up the next one, rotate them, stay alive. It wasn't a life, but it was what was available. He pulled out his wallet. The leather was cracked. He removed 3 20s and a 10. He held them out to Danny. "Can I just get the heart medication this week?" His voice was steady. This was a conversation he'd learned to have. The tall one with the expensive sneakers moved fast. He reached out and knocked the bills straight out of Frank's hand. They scattered across the pharmacy floor like leaves. Paper money doesn't drift gracefully. It tumbles. It falls. It ends up in places money shouldn't be. One landed half under a display of reading glasses. One caught against the base of the vitamin stand. "Nah," the boy said. "I think I want those." He bent down, moving with the ease of someone 30 years younger, and picked up the bills. His friends watched. They were learning something in this moment. They were learning that there were people in the world you could treat like this, and nothing would happen. No one would stop you. The older people in the pharmacy, and there were 3 of them besides Frank, were looking away, studying their receipts, checking their phones. The pharmacy tech, maybe 19 years old herself, had gone very still behind the counter. The 3 boys left with Frank's $60 and his prescription still sitting unclaimed on the bench. They were laughing as they walked out. Genuine laughter. They'd made themselves happy at the direct expense of a man who had built a library their children would someday use. Danny came around the counter immediately. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Frank, those little—" He stopped himself. "I can call the police. We have cameras." "Don't," Frank said. His voice hadn't changed. "They're just kids. They don't know any better." But he was lying. And they both knew it. They did know better. That was the worst part. They knew better, and they did it anyway, which meant they had learned that the world would give them nothing but laughter for cruelty. Frank looked at the 3 prescriptions sitting on the bench next to him. The heart medication, the blood pressure, the diabetes. Prioritizing, always prioritizing. He picked up the heart medication. He left the other 2 on the bench. He walked out of Riverside Pharmacy with $47.13 still in his pocket, which was exactly 13 cents more than he could afford to spend. No one knew what Frank was about to face. The medications would run out in 3 weeks. The blood pressure medication lasted 7 days. The diabetes medication, 10. After that, he would be managing something his body had stopped managing on its own 6 years ago. It wasn't a plan. Plans required hope. It was just what was coming. He didn't know that his daughter, Margaret, had called the pharmacy that same morning. She did this sometimes, checked in with Danny to make sure her father was picking up his prescriptions. Danny had told her about the incident. Margaret had called her brother Jack in Louisville. Jack had a motorcycle. Jack had left Millbrook 17 years ago because he needed space from the memory of their mother's death. But he had never forgotten how to come home. The engine was the first thing you heard. Not loud, just present. The specific rumble of a 2019 Harley-Davidson Street Bob. The kind of sound that travels through air and bone equally. The sound of someone who had stopped asking permission to take up space in the world. Jack Moretti pulled into the parking lot of Riverside Pharmacy at 5:47 that evening. He was 39 years old. He had been 12 when his mother died. That memory had shaped everything that came after. He wore black. He always wore black. His jacket was worn leather, with the sleeves pushed up to show the tattoo on his forearm, his mother's name in script that his daughter had helped him design. He was 6 feet 2 inches tall and had the kind of stillness that came from people who had learned to move only when it mattered. He'd driven 4 hours from Louisville. Not because his father had asked. Frank didn't ask for help anymore. Jack had learned that somewhere around year 2 of his father's silence. But Margaret had asked. And when your sister calls you because your father lost his blood pressure medication to 3 teenagers, you don't make time to think about it. You point your bike north, and you drive. Jack walked into Riverside Pharmacy at 5:51 p.m. Danny was restocking the vitamin aisle. He recognized Jack immediately. He'd been a regular here too, back when he was still in Millbrook. More importantly, he was Frank's son. The resemblance was there, the same blue eyes, the same direct gaze. "I'm looking for 3 teenagers," Jack said. "Tall one with expensive sneakers. 2 others. They were in here sometime around 2 p.m. They stole $60 and 3 prescriptions from an old man on the pharmacy bench." Danny nodded. He knew. Everyone in the pharmacy had known. He gave Jack descriptions. Names would come later. For now, Jack needed to find his father. Frank was eating a microwave dinner in his apartment above the laundromat. It was 6:15 p.m. He heard the motorcycle before he heard the knock on the door. The sound of a HarleY doesn't announce itself quietly. It announces that someone has arrived. Frank hadn't expected his son in 4 years. Not since his mother's birthday, and even then, the visit had been silent and strained. Jack stood in the doorway of his father's apartment, and Frank saw his mother in his face. The same high cheekbones, the same set to the jaw that meant a decision had been made. "You lost your medication," Jack said. "Margaret called you." "Margaret called me." Frank turned back to his microwave dinner. It was some kind of chicken breast with sauce that had never been near actual chicken. "You shouldn't have come." Jack moved into the apartment and closed the door behind him. The space was small. 68 years of accumulated life compressed into a studio apartment above a laundromat. There was a bed with a hospital blue blanket, a kitchenette with 2 pans, a window facing the alley, a framed photograph of Frank and Sarah on their wedding day. She was smiling so hard her eyes were closed. "The pharmacy has cameras," Jack said. "Danny can identify them. I told him not to call the police. He didn't. Margaret did. She called me instead." Frank set down the microwave chicken. His hands were shaking. After 78 years, his hands still shook when he was angry. After 78 years, he still thought he should be able to control it. "I'm fine," Frank said. "You're out of heart medication for 2 weeks because you can't afford all 3 prescriptions. You're managing your condition by rotating medications like you're in some third world country where pharmaceuticals are scarce. We live in Kentucky. You built this town. And you're managing your health like you're managing a food shortage." Frank didn't answer. This was the language Jack had learned in Louisville. Directness, accusation. The assumption that if something was wrong, you could simply state the fact of it, and something would change. That wasn't how Millbrook worked. In Millbrook, you accepted what came, and you didn't complain about it to your family. "Tell me who did it," Jack said. "Their kids. Tell me their names." Frank closed his eyes. He had spent 78 years teaching himself to accept things, to move forward, to not burden people with his own suffering. His entire identity was built on resilience that looked like acceptance. And now his son was asking him to break that identity by admitting that he'd been hurt. "Tommy Berkshire," Frank said quietly. "His 2 friends, I don't know them. But Tommy Berkshire. His father owns the real estate development company on Route 9. Jack didn't move. He didn't express rage. He didn't make any of the noises that Frank had braced himself to hear. Instead, he sat down on the edge of his father's hospital blue blanket. "I'm going to solve this," Jack said. "You're going to tell me if I'm wrong about anything, but I'm going to solve this. Tomorrow, and then we're going to figure out the medication situation." "Jack, I'm not asking," Jack said. "Margaret asked. She's your daughter. She cares about whether you survive the next 5 years. And you're going to let her care. Because that's what people do when they love each other. They accept help. They don't pretend they're fine when they're not fine." Frank opened his eyes. His son was staring at him with the kind of intensity that came from someone who had learned to make decisions quickly and hold them. Jack had left Millbrook not because he was running away, but because staying was killing him. And he had built a life in Louisville where he never had to compromise or accept things that were wrong. In Louisville, Jack was powerful. In Louisville, Jack made things happen. And now, he was home. The next morning, Jack started at Riverside High School. The principal's office was on the 2nd floor. The principal's name was Susan Tate. She had been a junior when Jack was a senior. She didn't recognize him at first, but then she did. The eyes, the intensity. The fact that he was carrying a memory of his mother that she could see moving through his face. Jack described what had happened at the pharmacy. He described it as precisely as Frank had described it. The tall boy, the expensive sneakers, the names. He didn't make accusations. He asked questions. "Do you know who Tommy Berkshire is? Do you have him in your student database? Can you tell me about the incident from this Wednesday?" Susan Tate said, "I can't discuss student matters with non-parents." "He assaulted an elderly man," Jack said. "That's not a student matter. That's a police matter. So either you talk to me, or I talk to the police, and I talk to them while they're standing in your office with a warrant." Susan Tate knew that tone. It was the tone of someone who didn't bluff. Tommy Berkshire was called down from his calculus class at 9:47 a.m. He wasn't worried. His father owned real estate. His father had money. His father had taught him that some people were the kind of people who mattered, and other people were the kind of people who didn't. His father had taught him that consequences were for people without connections. He saw Jack standing in the principal's office, and something shifted in Tommy's face. He was still confident, but the confidence had changed. It had become something more defensive. "You stole $60 and 3 prescriptions from Frank Moretti at Riverside Pharmacy on Wednesday," Jack said. Tommy didn't deny it. He looked at the principal instead, checking to see if this was real, if he should be defending himself. "I want the money back," Jack said. "I want the prescriptions replaced, and I want you to apologize to Frank Moretti in person." "Or?" Tommy asked, confidence still there, but thin now. Definitely thin. Jack stepped closer, not in a threatening way, just closer. "Or I'm going to make sure everyone in this town knows that you stole medication from an elderly man. Your friends will know. The football team will know. The kids at your church will know. The girls you want to date will know. And then I'm going to press charges, and the police are going to process you like they process everyone else." He paused. "And I'm going to make sure your father knows that his son is the kind of person who hurts 78-year-old men for fun." Tommy's face went white. The fear that went through him was genuine. He understood, in that moment, that there were people in the world who could make you small, who could diminish you, who could make your father ashamed of you. "I'll replace the prescriptions," he said quietly. "Good," Jack said. "Now write down your address." All three of you are going to the pharmacy tonight, and you're going to apologize to Frank Moretti while the pharmacist watches. And you're going to pay for the prescriptions yourself. If you don't have the money, you're going to figure out where to get it." Jack didn't stay for the apology. That wasn't his job. His job was to make sure Tommy Berkshire understood that there were consequences for cruelty. His job was to remake the small understanding in Tommy's brain that had convinced him old men didn't matter. By 7 p.m. that Wednesday, exactly 1 week after Frank had lost his medications, Tommy Berkshire was standing in Riverside Pharmacy with $82 in an envelope and an apology that took 2 minutes and started with Mr. Moretti. "I'm sorry I stole from you." Frank accepted the envelope. He didn't shake Tommy's hand. He just nodded once, slowly, the way you acknowledge someone who has finally understood something important. Jack sat in the parking lot on his HarleY, not watching, but present. Letting Tommy see him through the pharmacy windows. Letting Tommy understand that some people meant what they said. The engines arrived at 8:15 that evening. Not one. 23. 23 motorcycles pulling into the parking lot of Riverside Pharmacy in Millbrook, Kentucky, where a man named Frank Moretti had built his life one brick at a time for 78 years. 23. Harley-Davidsons and custom bikes, each one piloted by someone who had left Louisville in response to a single phone call from Jack Moretti. The first one through the door was Marcus. Marcus had been there when Jack's mother died. Marcus had brought flowers. Marcus had held Jack while he cried because Jack's father didn't know how. Marcus was the closest thing Jack had to a father, and Marcus had come north the second Jack asked. "We came to meet Frank," Marcus said to Danny at the pharmacy counter. And suddenly, the small pharmacy on Main Street in Millbrook, Kentucky, was filled with the specific gravity of people who had decided that something mattered. These weren't gang members. These weren't bikers in the way the news portrayed bikers. They were construction workers, nurses, one philosophy teacher, a firefighter, someone's uncle. They were people who had built their lives north of here, but they had come back because Jack had called. Frank walked out of the pharmacy bathroom where he'd been hiding, because of course he'd been hiding. He saw Marcus first. Then he saw the others. He saw the black leather jackets and the worn boots and the tattoos and the sheer fact of them. 23 people who had driven hours because his son had called. Frank started to cry. 78 years old. And he started to cry in the middle of Riverside Pharmacy while pharmacist Danny pretended to be very interested in straightening the decongestants. These men didn't say anything. They just stood there. 23 of them. Just stood there. The silence was complete. The silence was saying everything. Jack stood near the entrance. He wasn't in the group. He was apart from it. The way that leaders stand apart, watching his father understand that he was not invisible, that he mattered, that what had been done to him had mattered enough that 23 people drove north to make sure he knew it. Marcus approached Frank slowly. "Your son is a good man," he said. "Your son called, and we came. You understand why?" Frank shook his head. "Because you matter," Marcus said. "Because what happens to you matters. Because people don't forget the people who built their world, and you built this world." Frank couldn't speak. His body was shaking in the way bodies shake when they're finally allowed to feel something they've been preventing themselves from feeling for decades. The bikers left as quietly as they'd arrived. They didn't need to stay longer. The point had been made. They walked out to their bikes, started them up, and that sound, that collective engine rumble, shook the entire block. It was the sound of power that had chosen gentleness. It was the sound of people who could have been angry and had chosen to be kind instead. Frank and Jack stood in the parking lot, watching the taillights disappear down Main Street. Jack's hand was on his father's shoulder. Not gripping. Just there. Touching him the way his father had never let himself be touched by his own son. "I didn't want you to come," Frank said. "I know," Jack replied. "But I'm glad you did." Jack didn't answer. He didn't need to. He just stood there while his father cried on his shoulder in the parking lot of the pharmacy where, 1 week earlier, an old man had learned that the world thought he didn't matter. And then he'd learned that he did. The epilogue didn't happen at the pharmacy. It happened 3 weeks later, on a Sunday, when Jack picked up his father for breakfast at the diner on 5th Street. They had started seeing each other on Sundays. Not every Sunday, but starting. Frank's medications were filled every week now. Jack had made some calls. Some money had been arranged, the kind of thing that powerful people can make happen when they stop accepting that their elderly fathers should be managing their health by rotation. When they walked out of the diner, the motorcycle was parked right in front, Jack's bike gleaming. Frank had never ridden on it. He'd told himself he was too old for motorcycles, too frail, too damaged by age. "Get on," Jack said. "I'm 78 years old, Jack, and you're about to be a 78-year-old man who rode on a HarleY with his son," Jack said. Frank got on the bike. He put his arms around his son for the first time since Jack was 12 years old. And when the HarleY pulled out of that parking lot, it wasn't going south toward Louisville. It was going north. North through Millbrook, past the school library he'd built, past the water treatment plant he'd shaped with his hands, past the strip mall that had his name on a plaque he'd never been shown. Frank Moretti, invisible 78-year-old, rode through his town with his arms around his son, finally understanding that building the world hadn't been about receiving thanks for building the world. It had been about becoming someone worth coming home to. And his son had come home. The motorcycle disappeared over the hill. And in the silence that followed, Tommy Berkshire was at work at the pharmacy, volunteering as Danny's weekend helper, community service ordered by his father, who had finally understood that his son's character had been failing in real time, and he'd been the one allowing it to fail. Tommy was filling prescriptions now. Tommy was looking at elderly people when they came to the counter. Tommy was learning finally that they were real, that they mattered, that the world depended on people like Frank Moretti having built it, and he would have to spend the rest of his life paying attention to that fact. And Frank? Frank was learning that you could be 78 years old and your life could still change. You could still ride on a motorcycle. You could still have your son. You could still matter enough that people drove hours to prove it to you. The world hadn't fixed itself. It was still full of people who saw elderly men and looked away. But the world had one less person in it who thought that was okay. And for Frank, that was enough.